Welcome back to the show. Today I want to share some thoughts with you on the kind liberator. You're going to say, John, what in the world are you talking about? Hang in there with me for just a few minutes and you'll see where I'm going with this. There's been a lot of people in the world who have created an environment in their own country, in their own family, in their own workplace that they really don't have a clue what it means to lead people. And that's kind of like the big picture here today. But I want to go back several thousand years ago to share with you some examples of some people, specifically one person, that was able to radically change some people's lives, which now we're still talking about, almost 3,000 years later. Let me give you a couple quotes, two quotes of a guy, and I'll tell you who the quotes are from very, very soon. Quote, "In my experience, men who respond to good fortune with modesty and kindness are harder to find than those who face adversity with courage." Again, the theme here is modesty and kindness. The second quote is, "There is a deep and usually frustrated desire in the heart of everyone to act with benevolence rather than selfishness. And one fine instance of generosity can inspire dozens more." And then he goes on to talk about more. This guy that we're talking about is a gentleman by the name of Cyrus. And Cyrus lived around 600 BC or so. So we're talking ancient history. But there's some stories in here in his life, or at least a part of his life, that I think is going to stand out to you, and it certainly impacted me in a big, big way. Back then, some 2,600 years ago, there was a situation where the Jewish people were taken captive by a king who lived in Persia at the time, which is kind of sort of modern day Iran. And these people were taken from their part of the world, which was Israel, and they hustled over into the Iran area, and they lived there for a long time. Their families lived there, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So we're not talking just a few years. So that king died eventually, who took them captive, and there was another king that came into power. His name's Cyrus. And Cyrus was a different kind of guy. The prior king, he would, do a lot of damage, kill a lot of people, take a lot of prisoners, and really devastate people's lives for a number of years. But this guy, Cyrus, was more of a servant leader. And if you study that from time to time, you see people that dramatically change the world have a mindset of serving people that they're there to lead, not to lord over them, not to manage them, not micromanage them. And I think that you have worked with people, or at least maybe you know people who have worked with people who have worked with managers and not leaders. They've worked with people who have a title, but they don't really know how to serve people in their own lives. So this guy, Cyrus, they called him the founder of the Persian Empire. And it was really interesting that Cyrus understood the impact of his title. He understood that he was there to, as one text said, to fulfill, my paraphrase, to fulfill why he was born in the first place. Stop and think about that a minute. How many times haven't you met people who have lived 80, 90 years, and they have not even begun to fulfill why they were born in the first place? In fact, in the Old Testament of the Bible, there's a guy named Isaiah, and Isaiah takes a good chunk of the scriptures, and he foretold this guy Cyrus coming into power some years later. So he calls himself he was there to lead the people that he was there to serve. Now, there came a time in this story when Cyrus had inherited the people who were taken captive by this prior king, that he found out that their hometown, Jerusalem in this case, had been ignored for a long time, so much so that the walls were crumbling. They were just crumbling all over the place. And in that culture, walls kept people safe inside their cities. So this story says that there were 40,000 people who were enslaved at the time. So we're not only talking, just a few dozen people. We're talking thousands of people that were captive. But Cyrus always took pains to convey that he was not some conqueror. He was not some guy that really wanted to hurt people necessarily. In fact, he was a genius in portraying himself in an image of liberating people. Wait a minute, how can he be liberating people when over 40,000 people were living in his city under captivity? Well, I'll get to that in a few minutes. So he understood that his role could be impactful in a way that people in his culture had not done before. If you stop and kind of expand that thought just a little tiny bit, there are people in your own culture, there are people in your own family who have not succeeded in a way that maybe you want to succeed in or impact people's lives. So then you think because your family members haven't achieved certain things in a certain way, maybe means you can't achieve certain things in a certain way. I beg to differ with you, and you're going to see what I'm saying in a little bit. There are countless people who have saved and liberated and impacted people's lives throughout history. Let me just share a few. There was a guy named Ehud. Ehud was a left-handed guy. And in that culture, some 3,000, 3,500 years ago, being left-handed was a handicap because everybody was trained to be right-handed. And the warriors and the soldiers were trained to be right-handed and hold their tools and their weapons in certain ways in order to do what they needed to do as soldiers. Well, this guy Ehud, and I'll get back to Cyrus in a few minutes, Ehud was left-handed. And his left-handedness, his weakness, his handicap, was able to do some extraordinary things, which I'm not going to get into all that here, but the point is that he leveraged what some viewed as his weakness for the benefit of other people. You stop and think about your own life and my life. How many people haven't looked at you as weak in certain areas, and maybe you've been intimidated because of their opinions of your weakness or your handicap or your struggle, whereby if you leveraged that just a little tiny bit, you could rebuild some things in your own life and other people's lives that could be extraordinary. There was a woman years ago, centuries ago, by the name of Deborah. We're talking now about 4,000-ish years ago. Her name was Deborah. And in that culture, women were viewed as property. They had no rights whatsoever. But this woman, this Deborah, was in a situation where she was able to lead armies. She was able to lead men. And in that culture, again, it just didn't happen. And I'll say this multiple times in the program here today, that sometimes there are people that look at you who think that you can't do certain things in a certain way because it's never been done before. I would suggest that you prove them wrong. Another story, there was a guy named Gideon. And Gideon was, I'll be polite about it, but he was kind of sort of afraid of his own shadow. The story says that he was hiding from people that were going to war. He didn't want to have any part of it. He thought that he was less than average. So he was hiding out, trying to blend into the woodwork, if you will, not to be seen. Well, eventually there came part of the story where he was seen, he was noticed, and he was able to, through a very long story, he was able to do some dramatic, influential things in his life that impacted a lot of other people's lives because he eventually bought into the idea that he was more than what people thought he was. In fact, he bought into the idea that he was more than what he thought he was. In fact, the actual story says that he was, in his own mind, he was the least of the least. So when you and I have this mindset that we're the least of the least, then you're not even going to attempt to do extraordinary things because you don't think you have the capacity to do extraordinary things. I'm suggesting to you that maybe you could be wrong. Maybe if you reframed your own opinion of yourself and realized that there are people that are far less educated than you, far less talented than you, that have achieved some really amazing things in their lives because they've chosen to look fear in their face. They've chosen to look the intimidation of others in their faces and to keep moving forward to impact people that they may not even ever see. In fact, there's a gentleman that lived back in the 1400s named Martin Luther, and he talked about how people are moved. Things tend to happen, I'm paraphrasing his words, by doing things and not just saying things. Have you ever met a bully who says a whole bunch of stuff? They make themselves look bigger than everybody around them. But when you really get to the heart of the bully, they're just a facade. They're just a fraction of what they're trying to portray themselves to be. So they're all loud, they're all intimidating, but really they're generally speaking fearful people. I think you and I have a tendency to assume that people who have all their stuff together have all their stuff together. I would suggest today that is certainly not true. Again, the more books I read, the more stories I hear, the more famous people I meet, 99% of them have struggles that we may never even know about. In fact, I had a conversation with an individual, I'm not going to name his name, that disclosed that he had some health issues, some substantial health issues. But looking on the outside of it, you wouldn't know it. You know why? Because he kind of puts that on the back burner and focuses on people that want to make a difference in other people's lives. So if you assume that you don't have the goods, you don't have the wherewithal, you don't have the talent, you don't have the tenacity, you don't have the education, you don't have the genes to do extraordinary things, I'm suggesting to you that may not be the case at all. So let's go back to the story of Cyrus. So this guy comes to Cyrus and says, you know what, this city, our hometown, is crumbling. The walls are down, and in that culture, when the walls came down, when there were gaps in the walls, then invading armies could come in and ransack the entire city and take the plunder and take the wealth and women and children and make them slaves in other parts of the world. So having a rebuilt wall is very important back then. So this guy had the courage to come to the king. Now, he was a captive. He was in slavery in this Persian Empire. So it's a very long story. I'm not going to get to the long story of it. But he came to the king. He said, the king, our cities are broken, and I know I'm a captive. I know I'm property of you, the king. But for my people's sake, can we go back and rebuild our hometown? My paraphrase of the story. So the king agreed. The king agreed for not only this guy to go rebuild his wall, but to take people with him, experts, and people with skill sets that could rebuild this wall. Now, let's just pause a minute here. People that are true leaders want to see people that follow them excel. I know, again, I'll repeat it a couple times here today, but there are people that you've worked with and I've worked with that are so stuck on their title, they're so stuck on keeping people under their thumb that they don't want people to grow in their situation. They don't want people to evolve in their workplace. So they keep them down. They keep them under their authority, so to speak. Well, Cyrus wasn't that way at all. Cyrus understood that if his people were hurting, he had the power to lift that load, to help them heal. And in that story, in that situation, they were able to go back to their town, rebuild the walls, and create, now we're still talking about that town 3,000 years later, 2,500 years after the fact. As a result of Cyrus understood that his role was to serve people that were around him. There were situations where back in the 1940s that people in the United States government were kind of going back and forth whether or not to recognize Israel as their own state, their own country. Harry Truman kind of went back and forth on it until he had some conversations with some people that kind of rattled his cage a little bit and said, my paraphrase of this whole story, but you need to do the right thing. You need to lead from the front. You need to do things for people that may not be appreciated by many who really don't care about people. And that's where it gets really hairy. Because when you and I choose to serve people that are maybe ignored by other segments of the population, you're going to be viewed as the oddball. And sometimes, at least I do, I get a little intimidated by being viewed as the oddball, being viewed as the one that's doing things that nobody else is doing, or maybe only a few people are doing, for the benefit of people that I don't even know, I'll never meet in 100 years. That's when the real why comes out. Why are you doing what you're doing? But if it's not for the sake of other people with no expectation of any sort of return on investment, that's where your heart is really seen. That's where your passion, where your why is really illustrated perfectly. And so we're seeing over and over again that even back in the United States, we see people who were treated differently because of their skin tone. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower said, quote, "I believe as long as we allow conditions to exist that make for second-class people, we're making ourselves less than first-class people." Again, there are people who stand up and fight for people that don't even look like them, that don't even act like them, who maybe you wouldn't have dinner with them necessarily on the first meeting or the second meeting. But your role as a leader, your role as somebody who can influence people's lives, like King Cyrus did 3,600 years ago, he was able to influence the people's lives. The city of Jerusalem was rebuilt partially because of what he allowed to happen for the benefit of people that he was leading. Now think about that. What if every manager in every company, small or large, were focused on helping the people that they lead shine, to help those people find their why and their mission in life and what they're trying to achieve in life and mold the job around that? Don't you think the inspiration will climb in any workplace in the United States? I would say so. I'm asking you today to look at other people's lives in a way that serves them way more than it serves you. I would suggest to you that there are people still today, maybe in your own neighborhood, who maybe need a little bit of encouragement. Maybe people that are downtrodden. Maybe they don't think that they can go very far in life. And just maybe a sentence or two can dramatically change their outlook. Let me share an example. There's a young man I know of. His name, I'm not going to mention his name. He is in prison right now. He's a young man. And he, again, it's a long story. I'm not going to disclose parts of the story because then some of you might know who I'm talking about. But he's in prison right now, and he is discouraged. He feels that maybe, I'm assuming he feels that he doesn't have much hope or nobody really cares about him. So for the last several weeks, I've been sending him postcards, encouraging postcards, to kind of give him another point of view about what's possible in his own life. But you say, John, wait a minute, he's in prison right now. I get that. But he will be out of prison at some point. So do I want to invest in him while he's there instead of ignoring him like everybody else is ignoring people in prisons? That's another show for another day. What if we invested in people like that could maybe transform their mind, that can reframe what they're thinking about what's going to happen when they get out, and maybe they'll do things a little differently after the fact? I think there's people all around you who you fail to realize that are struggling, that are hurting, that are in a position that maybe your experience and or your knowledge can impact them in a dramatic way. Martin Luther King Jr., most of you know who he is. He said once upon a time, he said that his role, his demonstrations were to, quote, save the soul of America. Save the soul of America. Now, we all know what happened to him as a result of him stepping out of his comfort zone for the benefit of people that he may never have met. We know what happened to him. But his passion, his why, was to save the soul of America. And I think when you and I set aside our priorities and maybe the desire for recognition in our own lives and focus on lifting other people who can rebuild their lives and rebuild their walls for the sake of themselves, then you really don't need any accolades. I mean, we've gotten some awards for a few of our shows here and there, but it's really not about us. It's not about the people who make these shows happen. It's about you. It's about the people who watch the shows, and maybe there's a story or maybe there's a sentence that can lift you up and to give you a little tiny bit of inspiration or motivation to take the next step forward, or maybe several steps forward, to help you reach some sort of level and or wise in your own life. There's story after story through history of people that have dramatically made a difference by just doing these little things. Let me share an example in my own life. Back in my early 20s, the office I was working out of moved, and somebody else in the office was transferred into that particular office. Now, this person worked behind the desk. I was a sales rep back then. So this person came in, and every time I would see her in meetings and other places, I would stereotype her as being very crass and very, very loud and very nasty and very overt. And this is not even really meeting her, but seeing her from across the room. I'd look at her and say, man, she looks a certain way, and my perception was she carried herself in a certain way. And then when they transferred her into the office where I was, I'm like, great, now I have to work around this person that I'm assuming is not so nice and not so polite. I'll tell you this, within a week of me being in that office with this person behind the desk who would help the sales reps do certain things, my entire opinion of this individual changed. And then even to this day, we're talking now 29 years, 28 years later, I'm still thinking about her because the stupidity of my assumption of her from across the room was completely opposite of what reality is. And I share that example because you have done the same thing. You've looked across the room, you've looked across the street, you've looked down the street, you've looked at the next cubicle, you've looked in the next office, and assumed somebody has a certain way about them. But you really don't get a chance to get to know them. Because when you get a chance to know people, you see their heart, you see their passion, and then if you're smart, you'll figure out ways how to serve them, how to lift their load, help them to rebuild their walls in their lives just by leveraging some of the help that you've gotten over the years. None of us have gotten here by ourselves. Alex Haley said one time, I think, he said, when you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you know he didn't get there by himself. Kind of like what happens with you and I. If you've reached any level of anything in life, it's not because you've gotten there all by yourself. It's because somebody else has chosen to lift you up. They've chosen to set aside their day, their hour, their minute to serve you. I'm asking you today to look around you and the people that you could have even just the tiniest bit of influence over that maybe need to rebuild their walls in their life. Maybe their walls are torn down. Maybe they want to rebuild some measure of sensibility or some sort of understanding in their own life, that there might be a story that you can share with them, or maybe a piece of advice, or just walking alongside them and letting them know that they're not alone. This is what I'm talking about in the show today. Cyrus did not have to do what he did for the benefit of 40,000 plus people. He didn't have to do that. It cost him in his own part of the world to let these people go to do what they had a passion to do in their own lives. When you and I discover the whys of people's lives, it totally transforms your opinion of what they're doing. Let me say it again. When you and I discover the whys behind what people are doing, it transforms how you see their what and how they're doing things. And in fact, there are people I know of that are just, I'll be quite blunt, they're just nasty. They're nasty people. But when I dig a little deeper into their history, I see maybe a little bit of the reason why they're nasty, why they're mean, why they are backstabbers, why they're manipulators, why they're liars, why they're cheaters, why they're thieves. Because they didn't learn how to do it correctly. They chose to use all that pain from the past. They chose to use all the stuff, the baggage, and said, you know what, I'm going to behave in this way. And so they're acting this way. So if you look at people around you that are behaving in a certain way, or maybe that are behaving in a way that is completely opposite of what you feel comfortable with, then I would suggest to you that you look at their why. If you look at their why, you can really understand then what their what is. Because when you find out their why, it opens up a completely different viewpoint on these people that you are working around. In fact, the woman I was talking about at the office, she turned out to be the most bubbly, the most caring, the most huggable woman. That sounds weird, but she would hug us sales reps often and just be laughing. I mean, her laugh was contagious. But again, I looked at her as somebody who's being mean and nasty and crass, and that was not even reality. You do it all the time, and so do I. Shame on us. So I'm asking you to maybe be like Cyrus. Be like the guy who says, the first guy who came to the king, which is a no-no back then, and asked for something extraordinary. Sometimes you don't get because you don't ask. Sometimes you don't get because you don't ask often enough times. How many times haven't you given up because you stopped asking the first time, or the second time, or the third time? How many kids have you met, maybe you have, who have gotten stuff from you because they kept asking over and over and over and over and over again, and you got tired of them asking, so you gave it to them? There's one author that I heard of recently who was able to achieve some extraordinary results because she kept knocking on the door. She kept asking over and over and over again. She was persistent. Persistency sometimes matters. Persistency sometimes gets the results that you have been looking for. The one part of the scripture, Christ was asking his followers about this guy, John the Baptist, and one part of it was like, what are you looking for? A guy who's wishy-washy? My paraphrase of the text. So are you looking for some guy who's kind of mediocre? Or are you looking for somebody who's extraordinary? I think you're more extraordinary than you think you are. You say, John, but I don't have all this. I don't have the talent. I don't necessarily have the skills. But you don't know that because you haven't tried certain things that are outside of your comfort zone. I'm asking you today to be like Cyrus, to choose to serve people that are maybe unlike you, that maybe you have never met, for the benefit of somebody else. If you did that every day, if you served people that you don't even necessarily know intimately, every day, you're going to see that your entire world transform. And imagine if you taught other people to do the same thing, their entire world will transform. Then a lot of people's lives are going to be rebuilt and grown up and fortified as a result of you stepping out of that comfort zone in order to make a difference in somebody else's life. That's what I'm asking you to do today and every day. My name's John Carver, and I appreciate you watching. We'll be back real soon.